This is For the Governed, a podcast series brought to you by Athlon. Here are your hosts, Tim Markison and Ron Cates.
Welcome to another edition of the Athlon's podcast. I'm Ron Cates. Joining me as always is Tim Markison, the founder and CEO of Athlon's. Tim is about to embark on a remarkable adventure. He's a recreational cyclist. He's approaching his 60th birthday, and he's going to celebrate it in a way by riding his bicycle across the United States, starting in San Diego, California, riding his bicycle all the way to Jacksonville, Florida. That's 3,000 miles in 40 days.
Yep.
The purpose is to raise awareness and funding to prevent child abuse, to fight child abuse, to help victims. But why a ride? Why this? How'd this all come together?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I really had to do a lot of introspection of why this. So part of it is I like physical challenges, and a friend and I, we've always talked about doing some big bike ride. So that idea has been in my head, but what I like about this is it gives me an opportunity to focus on my messaging for child abuse prevention. It gives me 40 days where that's my sole purpose, really, for every single day, is to focus on the messaging of child abuse prevention. And I think it's a newsworthy story. A 60-year-old guy who's not a professional cyclist or ever was even close to a professional cyclist riding across the country. And then the messaging that we're bringing forward about how to really go about starting to minimize the numbers of child sexual abuse victims. I think our approach is unique there, so that gives us the platform. And then the other part is really going to be, a healing journey for me. I don't know exactly how, but what I've noticed over the last several years, and you've known me during that stretch, I couldn't get through telling my story without having to stop and choke back, the emotions. And not that, it's still not emotional for me to talk about what happened to me, but I can now speak about it without, breaking down for the most part.
Well,
so
if I may,
yeah.
Tim, I think that's partly because you've come to realize that getting the message out is so important that your personal discomfort is secondary to making a difference. Am I right a little bit?
Yeah, that's definitely a factor. As we've talked in previous.
I don't think it's any more comfortable for you to talk about this, but I think that because the power of doing something about it is so strong to you that you just suck it up and do it.
I think there's an element of that. As we've talked about before, about 5 years ago, I had flashbacks where I hadn't had flashbacks in almost 20 years. And that really shifted something inside me where I had to become a vocal advocate against child abuse. So that is part of it. And as I talk about what happened to me, the healing inside me and the confidence is growing. A lot of the reasons why victims don't talk about what happened to them as a child is fear and shame and guilt. And I had felt all those, which is up until I was in my mid-50s, those were dominating my decisions about going public with what happened to me. And, something shifted inside me where it's more important for me to talk about what happened and start to make a positive difference to help other victims of child abuse start to heal from their wounds, and also in preventing kids from becoming abused so they don't have to go through what I went through.
The problem is just remarkably humongous. I know people don't like to talk about it, but the statistics are absolutely frightening. So I totally understand there's this humongous effort on your part, this humongous ride from one end of the country to the other on a bicycle. You're not a professional cyclist. You were, I'm going to be honest here, you were barely a recreational, you were an occasional cyclist, barely a recreational cyclist. And I say this from the point of, in my former lifetime, I've coached 9 national professional champions in cycling, dozens of U.S. national champions, professionals who've gone on to medal or to be on the podium at the Tour de France. I know how to train for this, and I know where you came into this was at a very, very low fitness level. I've also never seen anyone adapt so quickly. We'll talk about that in a future podcast. So your dedication to the training has been just phenomenal. So, but nonetheless, this for you is going to be an incredibly challenging event. But I think that goes along with the size of the problem.
I agree. Yeah, because I mean, my journey of recovery was challenging, and I think it is for every victim. So let me just kind of go back a little bit with some statistics. We had talked about, it really is an overwhelming problem. The data, the data is really kind of all over the place because it's estimates. So, we don't have an accurate accounting of how many girls are sexually assaulted in childhood, how many boys are sexually assaulted in childhood. So depending on how a study was conducted, the data varies from 1 in 4 girls to, double that, or 1 in 8, and then for boys it's anywhere from 1 in 5 to 1 in 20, and then there's some estimates that say 40% of all children have been sexually abused. So the data is all over the place.
But I know that when you talk about the stats, you tend to use a pretty conservative set, or the set that's most widely agreed upon.
The one that I have heard the most frequently is 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys. So that's the data I've been using for my number crunching. So that's 20% of our population that have been sexually assaulted. So when you look at, we have 330 million people in this country. 20% of that is 66 million. 22% of the population is children. So that's about 72 million children in our country. So that means 20% of that is 14.5 million children will be sexually abused before they hit their 18th birthday. 14.5 million.
That's just startling. Yeah. It's jaw-dropping. I know this because I learned it from you. Those stats have not improved hardly at all, if at all, in decades.
Right. I mean, those were the same data points I was hearing 30 years ago when I started to deal with my issues. And then I found some data on the number of victims a sexual perpetrator or a sexual offender has. And the data suggests that about 70% of perpetrators will abuse anywhere from 2 to 9 kids. And then you've got 20% of perpetrators abuse 20 to 40 or more children. So I took that and I normalized it. So on average, across all of sex offenders, they'll average about 8.5 children per sex offender. So given the 14.5 million children that will be sexually assaulted before their 18th birthday, 8.5 victims per perpetrator. We currently have about 1.7 million sexual perpetrators in our country right now.
Now, I know you're a survivor. Most survivors develop destructive behaviors.
Yeah.
What are some of those?
So, it all stems from the pain that being a victim of child abuse has. And there's data out by the CDC that says the more frequent the abuse, the more traumatic the abuse, the greater the physical and or psychological damages. So for me, I very low. I had no self-esteem. I thought I was worthless, stupid, ugly. I couldn't do anything right because that was the messaging that I was fed.
So not only are the acts degrading, but often the perpetrator is degrading to the victim in a more general way. Yeah.
And it led to severe depression, anxiety attacks. I was fearful of everything. And it created such a void and pain in myself that, and this is true of victims, we have this pain and that we look for ways to fill. And that's where we start to develop these destructive behaviors. So alcoholism, drug abuse, sexual addictions, and on with those type of things. most victims of sexual abuse turn those destructive behaviors towards themselves. A very small percentage, about 2% of child abuse survivors actually turn those destructive behaviors towards others. So that's really kind of at the core of the messaging that we're going to be advocating on this ride, and what we've been advocating for a while now is for child abuse to start to end. Abusers have to stop abusing. I mean, it's kind of an obvious statement, but from the literature I've read, from the programs that are out there, there's nothing really geared towards that. There's a lot of great programs to help children to deal with being in an abusive environment, encouraging them how to speak out about against what happened to them, talk about it. There's a lot of great programs for school administrators and family members to identify that children being victimized, but that's all after the fact. So the only way that we can really start to put a dent in child abuse is abusers have to stop abusing. And when I look at the data suggests that 75% of abusers were themselves victims of child abuse. So if we can start to get those people to address their issues, their pain from being abused as themselves, then those self-destructive behaviors will diminish, and the compulsion to act out against others will diminish. So that's really the message that I'll be conveying on this bike ride, and that Interwoven Circles is really supporting, and you've been helping a great deal with all of that. So I really, really encourage perpetrators to deal with their own wounds. And they can do so, through therapy, through group sessions, and they can just focus on themselves, focus on, the damage that was done to them by their perpetrators. They don't have to get into the acts that they're doing right now unless they feel, compelled to, but heal those wounds. And hopefully, as they're healing those wounds, they're going to come to a point in their recovery where they want to make amends to their victims.
Now, as an adult, you actually confronted some of the perpetrators.
I did. When one of the steps when I was doing an inpatient treatment was to confront my perpetrators, and I don't know if that was a good idea or not, and probably in retrospect it probably wasn't a good idea, but I did it anyway.
Well, before you went, what were your expectations? What were you hoping to accomplish?
Well, ideally, it would have been an acknowledgement that, yes, that happened, and some ownership by my perpetrators of the abuse that they did towards me. But when I confronted my perpetrators of what I was remembering and what they did to me, they blatantly denied it. And, I'll never forget the way they said it. It was, "That's preposterous." And, that was a word I've never heard them say before. And then since I've heard that, it's amazing how many times that guilty people, when they're accused of something they did and they're denying it, they use the word preposterous.
Or something out of their ordinary realm of vocabulary.
Yeah. Because, that's just not a word that's in everyday communication. But that's the word so many perpetrators use to deny what they've done. So I really hope that as abusers are starting to deal with their issues, and it really, there's that phrase out there that hurt people hurt people. It really stems from all of this, and there's a lot of validity to that. But as they're dealing with their own pain, it's going to mitigate the desire to inflict pain on others, because that void inside them is going to be filled by changing the view of themselves. And the more positive view we have of ourselves, the less destructive behaviors we're going to have. And so back to my perpetrators, in hindsight, I had they have, acknowledged what they did to me, took ownership of it, and apologized for it, that would have immensely helped me. It would have shortened my recovery time by years, because I spent years doubting the reality of what happened to me, doubting my own senses, wondering if if any of this was real at all. And it bled over into, a distrust of all of my senses and experiences. So it took a long time and a lot of effort to put that into perspective, that yes, this really, really did happen to me. And it was pretty horrific stuff that did happen.
Well, as a child, they told you to deny it, to never talk about it. So I think denial is probably a pretty important defense mechanism to get through things, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that was denial.
No one wants to think this horrible thing happened to me, and I'm the type of person that would happen to, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I can't even imagine the frustration that you've gone through.
So it was challenging, but I'm at a point in my life, and I have been for a while now, where I have a very fulfilling life. And we'll actually get into more detail that in our next podcast. But, looking back on my life, knowing how difficult the recovery journey is, there's days that are just awful, that it's hard to get out of bed. I don't know if I want to live anymore. It seems like it's never going to end. And yet, knowing that and knowing where I am today, I'd go through it again. My preference would have been to never have been abused at all. But since, I don't have that choice, I would take this path again and endure the struggles of recovery, because getting to this stage in my life where I'm living a very fulfilling life, words can't even describe that. It's something that has to be experienced. And I hope that all victims of child abuse can get to that point where they can experience a fulfilling life.
To find out more about the ride, to donate to the ride, to support the ride, become a sponsor, for resources, go to cycletoendabuse.com. One more time, that's cycletoendabuse.com.